And I would obviously like to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for West Suffolk, both for securing this debate but also for the manner in which he introduced it. He's clearly somebody with a great deal of expertise on this issue, and I think the way he outlined both the historical context and the more recent developments has certainly set the tone for an interesting and productive debate this morning. I would also like to welcome the Minister to his position, and I'm sure this will be the first of many interesting and enjoyable debates on a wide variety of foreign policy issues. Mr. Caton, this is a good time to debate Syria and the Middle East, not least because of developments recently in the region and the change in the US approach to the Middle East. Obama has made engaging with Syria a key point of his foreign policy, which is a very welcome change from the Bush years, and I think can give us some cause for optimism. As has already been outlined by various honourable members, this kind of engagement with Syria is absolutely vital for ensuring peaceful withdrawal from Iraq, maintaining peace and stability in Lebanon, and indeed the Arab-Israeli peace process, which we all so desperately want to see more progress on. But historically, Syria has been more isolated with its support for Hezbollah and Hamas and its very close ties with Iran. And these have given countries reason to be cautious in their dealings with Syria. But I would argue they're also the very reasons why we should and must engage, because the influence Syria has across the region makes it a vitally important player. Recently, George Mitchell, the US envoy for Arab-Israeli peace, made a visit to Damascus, and that is a hugely positive step. Traditionally, the UK has been somewhat less hostile towards Syria than the US has, and we've maintained those diplomatic relations and engaged directly on regional and consular issues. And I think this approach has to be very much welcomed, because engagement is the cornerstone for how we can actually use influence with Syria to try to unlock some of the problems in that very troubled region. The Honourable Member for West Suffolk talked about the close links between Syria and Iraq and mentioned that this is not the place to go over the arguments about the war, which I would agree. But we do later today have the Opposition Day debate on the Iraq inquiry, and I think it's important that that inquiry, with its broader remit, is also able to look at the impact that the war had on the wider region and indeed on Britain's foreign policy objectives within that wider region, because, as he said, I think that they have been somewhat undermined by our actions in Iraq. There is the issue of Syria having allowed insurgents to cross the border into Iraq, which has clearly made the situation there much more difficult. And indeed, to quote the Foreign Affairs Committee 8th report of 06-07, the Syria expert Patrick Seales said that Syria had allowed a few jihadists to go across that territory because the Syrians do not want the Americans to have too easy a time in Iraq, because they think the Americans will win there and they will be next. And clearly that kind of sense of vulnerability and concern will have been a key motivator in Syria's decisions. I hope that now, with the change of approach, Syria will recognise and have some confidence that they will not be next, and that will help to build the trust for them to clamp down on those types of insurgency crossings into Iraq. Obviously, there is a fear with the troop withdrawal and handover that, in fact, this will be a vulnerable time in Iraq and insurgency activity could instead increase. The refugee situation in Syria of the Iraqi refugees was mentioned by the Honourable Member for Birmingham Northfield. And I think it was very interesting for us to hear firsthand about his experiences seeing the refugee camps, and indeed some of the positive stories he had to tell about education and some of the development there. But clearly that places a huge stress on Syria, and therefore I think it helps to increase the case of pointing out to Syria that it is in their interests to engage more regionally, to have a prosperous and stable Iraq next door as a trading partner, but also to facilitate the return of refugees at a pace, obviously, that is appropriate, but to lessen the burden that they are currently experiencing. And I think in foreign diplomacy, then using the self-interest of countries to encourage certain behaviour is often the most successful approach. I was certainly.
I'm very grateful to she's right that the issue of repatriation of some Iraqi refugees will be the right option. But I think the point I was trying to make, and I think the thing we need to tackle as an international community, and certainly the views of a number of the Iraqi refugees themselves, is a programme for resettlement elsewhere may actually be the long-term solution for a number of those refugees. In some cases that will be in Syria and the Middle East. In other cases it will be in the wider world, and we really do need to think through how that's achieved.
Swinson.
The Honourable Member makes a very important point, and of course that just highlights the importance of Syria actually being part of that wider engagement, because in creating that solution, that's not something that will happen with just one country, and it needs to be part of a much wider discussion. I was certainly give way. Yeah.
Just on that point, because during my visits to Syria, it's an issue that I've talked about as well, and given the work that the Syrian government has done in absorbing perhaps 1 million or more refugees and giving them healthcare and giving them education and giving them housing, surely purely on a humanitarian level, the international community should be doing more in giving some sort of funding towards that to support the Syrian government.
Swinson.
Well, I certainly think that they ought to be praised for what they have done, and no doubt the humanitarian agencies will be very involved and should be involved. It's quite right that particularly, and without going into all of the arguments about the Iraq War, but particularly where we have certainly contributed to problems and to what I view as a terrible mistake, then I think we also have a responsibility to help to clear up the mess that we've made and provide that kind of support. I was very intrigued, turning to the issue of Israel and Palestine, by the comments of the Honourable Member for Birmingham, Sparkbrook and Small Heath, who I was feeling slightly despondent when he talked about being unable to see a two-state solution. As someone who supports a two-state solution, I thought that was perhaps going to be a very pessimistic comment, but I was interested to hear his suggestions that actually a 3 or 4 state solution might ultimately be the end point that's reached. I don't know whether that's the case, but what I would say in response to that is what is most important is that whether it's 2, 3 or 4, is that the word solution is what really matters, and that is surely the end that we all want to see. And clearly Syria will play a vitally important role in that. But various members have mentioned the key importance of the Golan Heights in terms of getting Syria involved in that peace process, and this is obviously a bottom line for them. I haven't been to Syria like many of the members in this debate, but I have been to the Golan Heights on a trip to Israel some years ago. And it's clearly a very contested piece of land, but as has also been pointed out, it's not just a territorial dispute. There's the human aspect of it in terms of displacement. And indeed, something which surprised me somewhat when I went there was actually also the strategic importance of it in terms of water, that key resource which perhaps sometimes in the UK we have far too much of with our climate, but particularly in drier areas of the world can actually be a very strategically important resource. And I think that increasingly water will replace oil as the key resource that might be in a position to provoke conflict, and it's something we need to be very aware of. In terms of Israel's approach, obviously pre-election Netanyahu was promising not to return the Golan Heights, but there is some cause for optimism, and that his stance may have softened when he told George Mitchell that I am unwilling to commit in advance to a full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. Well, that seems to be some move from his pre-election position, and so it's not yet clear whether this could be a concession he would make later. Obviously, the basing of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Damascus gives Syria an obvious role, potentially, in the peace negotiations. And if we can resolve the issue of the Golan Heights, then Syria might be more willing to exert influence over Hamas to support the peace process. There's obviously a key economic imperative in looking at the situation with Syria. Their isolation and, as has already been mentioned, the suspension of the EU Trade Association Agreement has clearly caused difficulties for Syria. And there is a danger in Syria being too isolated and ending up to be too dependent on Iran. They've obviously had close ties, and that's something which can actually be a potential danger. And perhaps if Syria were to distance itself a little more from Iran, some of these other negotiations might end up being easier. So while the EU Trade Association Agreement suspension in 2005 was done for very sound reasons, it actually might end up being counterproductive. And so I think it really is worth us looking again at how we would be able to shift economic incentives to encourage Syria to play a fuller role in the international community, including the trading ties that come with that. Obviously, the situation in Iran at the moment is moving incredibly quickly. And Syria will be keeping a close eye on the demonstrations, perhaps with a fear that might provoke similar unrest within Syria. Obviously, and I'm sure the Minister will mention the diplomatic issues over the last few days with the expulsion of the diplomats, which is really of a great concern, I'm sure, to us all, as indeed have been the pictures of violence on our television screens, which, just from a human point of view, cannot be ignored in terms of the worry that they cause. Although I do think that it is right that the government and generally within Britain that we have not intervened and sought to tell the Iranians what to do. History has shown that type of intervention will actually not be helpful. And so I actually think that the government has taken the right view on that issue. Just in conclusion, Mr. Caton, I would say actually that the government's approach to Syria is broadly welcome, because regular engagement has to be the right way forward and making progress step by step. Syria is clearly suffering financially from the EU trade suspension, from US sanctions, from the fact their oil reserves are going down, and repeated drought, which goes back to the earlier issue I mentioned of water, plus this huge burden that they have been bearing well and living up to humanitarian responsibilities, but this influx of Iraqi refugees. And I would just say that actually brings dangers and opportunities. It's very difficult for the Syrian people, and if they were allowed to continue in isolation, that could lead to them becoming closer to Iran. But the opportunity is there for us, as the UK, along with the EU and the US, to offer some new economic incentives for political reform and cooperation, particularly in relation to the Iraq issue and the peace process in Israel and Palestine. And that engagement in the region and directly, bilaterally with Syria is very important. The government, I do believe, has broadly taken the right approach, but it is also right that this House continues to discuss these issues. And as we hope, positive developments will continue to occur, and we should return to this issue on a regular basis.